Connection. Who was it? Anne. Okay. That's right. Okay. I met her, but I can't
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for 10 Pictures, A History of Photography with Peter Halpert. I'm Joy Alice Eisenhower. I'm the Cultural Arts Director here at the Boulder JCC, and we're so honored to be hosting this program today. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Rose Foundation, SCFD, CCI, and the Lichter family. We acknowledge that all of our arts and culture programming is made possible by the generous support of our donors, sponsors, and many of you here today. So thank you so much. We'll have some time after the program for Q&A, and then we'd like to invite you to stay for a little social time and a little light fare. And I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that there is a war happening in Israel and the Middle East. We recognize that this is potentially a challenging time for you and our community, and that the Boulder JCC is a place to convene and to connect together in our community. And I'm just really grateful to have you all here with us today. Thank you for being here. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Peter Hay Halpert. Peter is a private art dealer, collector, author, and curator. He has written as contributing editor to American Photo and as a columnist for the Art newspaper, as well as articles for Aperture, Art in Auction, Art News, and Art in Antiques, and the International Herald Tribune. He has authored more than 10 books, including 3 on photographs of Hiroshi Sugimoto, and has written articles on Andy Warhol's Polaroid photographs, David Hockney's interest in photo-based technology, and the role of photography in Francis Bacon's paintings. He has been a professor at SVA, ICP, and a lecturer at Trinity College and the University of Pennsylvania, and has spoken at universities and museums around the world, including the Whitney, the High Museum of Art, and the Royal College of Art. His personal photography collection comprises close to 4,000 pieces and has been exhibited widely. We are so delighted to have you here to join us today. Thank you so much. Please welcome Peter Halpert.
Thank you. Try not to fall off the stage. So, first of all, I want to say I'm very honored to be here. I came here, Joy, when was Joe's concert? About a year ago. A friend of mine, Joe Alterman, who lives in Atlanta, jazz pianist, came here. He has a family connection here in Boulder. I think it's his aunt who invited him. He's a terrific jazz player. I've seen him in New York at Blue Note, and he's just terrific. And I came to this concert, and I was looking around in this hall, and I was like, wow, this facility is really nice. So you have a beautiful space here, and I'm very honored to be invited to actually give a talk in the same space, although Joe drew a bigger crowd. That was understandable, though. I also want to thank you for taking time off to come for this lecture. I was telling Joy, I sent out an e-blast this week to, I have an email list of like 10,000, literally, and it went all over the world, and I didn't expect any of these people to be showing up here today, but let people know what I'm doing. And a friend of mine who was a paratrooper with the IDF and now lives in New York wrote back to me, and he said, rough week for an event in the Jewish community. And so I echo Joy's sentiments. Thank you for taking the time in what is a tough, rough week. Maybe more than just a rough week, maybe longer. Anyway, so There's a guy named Philip Lorca de Corsia, photographer, who said at one point, photography is a language everyone speaks. And after 2007, he amended it to say, photography is a language that everybody thinks they speak. What happened in 2007? Can anybody tell me? Yeah, you got it, iPhone. I'm assuming that everybody here is sitting there with a camera in their pockets right now. This used to be a medium that it was the medium of our times, but not everybody was practicing it. Now, we've all got cameras in our pockets and we're all taking pictures. I never identify myself as a photographer, and yet I have probably 11,000 photos on my iPhone right now. So I'm right in the pack with everyone else. Photography is a language that everybody thinks they speak. But as I said, photography is the medium of our times. I remember driving from Albuquerque to Santa Fe with Dwayne Michaels once. Some of you may know who he is, contemporary photographer in his 90s now, still with us. Affectionately referred to him as Saint Dwayne. And Dwayne has for a long time incorporated text in his photographs to the point where he ended up doing series that were just drawings and text. There were no photographs in the photographs, but they were still done as gelatin silver prints. And I asked Wayne, why are you still calling yourself a photographer? Why aren't you, moving into drawing, per se? And he said, no, photography is the medium of our times. And I say, he's in his 90s now, so he's basically lived through our times. And we are bombarded with photographic images. There was an organization based in Philadelphia, the Pew Charitable Trust, and I remember they came out with a study that said each of us sees approximately 10,000 photos a day. That is a scary number, but you have to break it down. Yes, we've got everything we're looking at online, if we're posting on Facebook or Instagram. But even if you're looking at the news, they're flashing up still photos in the corner. So it really has become the medium of our times. It is the medium that we all innately understand in a way that is not true for sculpture or painting. You can go right now, there's a terrific Ed Ruscha show at MoMA in New York. I was just there a couple weeks ago, and I went through the show, and I think the work's totally approachable and understandable, but thank you. But you need to understand where Ed Ruscha came from and who he was working with in California and what movement he's part of. I can show you a photograph in the subway of New York, an advertising picture. I can pick up a magazine. I can show you the September issue of Vogue. We can go to an exhibition at the Denver Art Museum and look at photos there. It's like we will kind of innately be able to understand what's going on when we're looking at those pictures, for the most part. So, how did this all start? Here we are at the very beginning. Oh, by the way, I lied. When I said 10 pictures, we're getting more than 10. You knew that though, right? So, but there are 10 key pictures and artists here, and they are identified. And so if we get to the point in the lecture where it says number 5 and you're bored to tears, you know there's still 5 more coming. You might as well leave then. But otherwise, we're going to start, and this doesn't even count as number 1. I'm cheating right from the start. This is what we consider to be the very first photograph. Helios, sun, Niepce, experimenting with photography, took this from the rooftop where he was living, and this image still exists. It's down at the Harry F. Ransom Center in Austin, Texas, part of the UT collection. And it was a photo historian, Helmut Gernsheim, who came across it and said, as far as he could figure out, this was the very first photograph. And so it's obviously still fixed, but it is extremely fugitive. And if you ever get to see it, you're probably going to be looking at it under a velvet cloth. So that's 1827. That's the first image. But things don't really start taking off until 1839. Now, you have to remember, we're in the Industrial Revolution, so it's fascinating, to me at least. Photography starts with 2 practitioners working completely independently, one French, one British, not sharing notes, competing with one another to get their images out there first, to be the first photographer, and they both launch essentially at the same time. And they're using 2 completely different processes. Daguerre, wait a minute. We're still looking at Niepce there, but there we go. Okay, number 1. Daguerre, after whom the daguerreotype is named. So the format here for the talk is whenever I introduce a new artist, you're going to get a picture of the artist in addition, and that's Daguerre himself down in the lower right. So Daguerre starts with an image. How many have seen a daguerreotype in person? Quick show, yeah, I would think so. I mean, they're flea market finds. We used to be able to get them for a couple bucks, then $5 and $25, and now they're 5,000. And those are still the flea market ones. The really good ones are about 300,000 now. But this is Daguerre's first daguerreotype, and I love this image. There's a guy, I'm trying to look at it from here. Okay, here we go. Right here. So, these are sun pictures. He's got a metal plate that he's covered with an emulsion. He's exposing to light, and then he fixes with mercury vapors. That's the process that he came up with. And these days, there are contemporary daguerreotypists who are still working. They have never been able to get their pieces to look exactly like Daguerre's daguerreotypes, and the main reason is because nobody uses mercury vapor anymore to fix the images. They would die. It's slightly toxic, but it's a very long, photographically speaking, exposure, but we do have 2 people in the picture. And the reason why is because the one guy is getting his shoes shined. And he was stationary long enough that he actually showed up in daguerreotype's first daguerreotype, and he wasn't just a blur. At the same time, over in England, at a place called Laycock Abbey, which still exists and is still in the Talbot family, William Henry Fox Talbot starts a process that involves salted paper prints, coating paper with an emulsion and exposing them to light. And we kind of know who won. Nowadays, Steve here just handed me a photograph on paper. There aren't really many people making daguerreotypes anymore. But what's so interesting is, for a period there, it looked like it was going to go exactly the other way. Again, go back to the fact this is the Industrial Revolution. So when Daguerre starts this process of making daguerreotypes, he leaves the patent information to the French government and says, make this available to anybody who wants to use it for free. The technology was available to anybody who wanted to access it, except the English, because the French and the English were competing with each other during the Industrial Revolution. Talbot, on the other hand, held on to his process, and the guidelines for the original Royal Photographic Society were it couldn't include anybody who was using photography for any kind of commercial or profit-making purposes. It was only for gentlemen amateurs of a certain class. So he was self-delineating right from the start. And I remember talking to a woman, Mary Foresta was a curator at the Smithsonian and did a major daguerreotype exhibition about 10, 15, 20 years ago. Anyway, I was talking to her and she said, daguerreotypes were the personal computers of their time. First of all, they took off like crazy. Everybody had access to a daguerreotype photographer and had daguerreotype photographs. Also, they changed the way that we communicated. Because previously, let's say you were a young soldier, you're going off to a war. Well, if you're just in the rank and file, the likelihood that you were going to have a portrait taken and, well, portrait painted and then leave that with your mother or a sweetheart was very limited unless you were of a certain class and economic status. But daguerreotype photography changed that completely. I mean, the daguerreotype photographs that many of you know and have seen probably included pictures from our Civil War. Because in the United States, itinerant daguerreotype photographers started traveling around the country in wagons filled with all their equipment, and they would go to battlefields and just line up, and they would do portraits right before a major battle. And some of those still survive today. They're very, very hardy, whereas Talbot's first pictures are extremely fugitive. They really cannot be exposed to much light. So it looked like initially Daguerre was going to have won the war in terms of which process was going to take hold. But it shifted. The daguerreotype, I remember once I was talking to a daguerreotype collector. Really interesting guy. Ralph Boa is a retired policeman who collects daguerreotypes related to fashion. And I said, wow, that's a pretty narrow field, but I'm sure you can find a lot. And he said, well, I only like the early stuff. And I said, the early stuff? Ralph, daguerreotypes are the early stuff. What are you talking about? He said, no, I only like between 1839 and 1841. And he's got shoe boxes filled with these daguerreotypes that fit his criteria of 1839 to 1841 fashion-related images. These itinerant photographers were out there all over the United States and Europe. But the daguerreotype segues to the tin type, the amber type, and by 1900, it is an antique process, whereas the paper prints are here today. So, joint number ones, Daguerre and Talbot. Now, hold on, I want to, there. When did we start? Okay, all right, I got to keep it moving. Gustave Le Gray, and a picture of him down in the corner there. So people think that initially photography was kind of just about documenting what was going on out there. And you see these pictures of whether photographers went off to Egypt or Asia or traveled around Europe, whatever. It's kind of just a function of documenting their times. Queen Victoria herself, one of the first patron of the Royal Photographic Society, commissioned a number of photographers to go out and photograph her railroads. And so we have these amazing albums documenting the railroads as they traveled throughout the United Kingdom. But I want to show you that right from the beginning, artists working with photography were interested in doing some things that were quite unexpected. This is called the Great Wave, 1857, so we're only about 20 years beyond the invention of photography, and this looks like a pretty straightforward photograph, except I'm going to tell you this was made from 3 different negatives. And right from the beginning here, you've got an artist working with photography, and he's literally got 3 different pictures, a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And he puts them all together in this composition to get one piece. But, you know, it's an example of an artist manipulating the medium to his ends. And yet other times, Le Gray would take what is a straight photograph. Here you see that is from a campaign in Egypt and another seascape. Now I'm going to move us over to Alfred Stieglitz. Okay. The great promoter of photography in the United States. Not just photography, he was a great art dealer. He came from means. He, in New Jersey, set himself up in New York City, showed other photographers, Paul Strand, painters. He had several important galleries, tended to be very small, but highly influential, and also published 2 series of photographic journals, photo works. that had a huge influence. This picture at one point was the record holder for the most expensive photograph ever sold publicly. It sold for $395,500, which may seem like a lot of money, but hold on to that thought. There are only 5, I think, prints in existence. The Met, MoMA, Boston Museum, Philadelphia Museum, and this one, which is in private hands. And one of the things that was kind of interesting, I went to see them all in person, to handle them and see what was going on in the prints. This one, when he printed it up, he gave it to a woman who had been a great patron and supporter of his work, and he said, "Aileen, this is a particularly fine print, I want you to have this." And so I wanted to see what the other ones were like. This was the fine one. And one of the things that I discovered was Stieglitz himself never figured out whether it was, like, what was on top. Take a look at the image, you'll see they're reversed. The print in the Boston Museum is clearly marked. Stieglitz signed it and dated it, so we know where the bottom of the print is, and it's completely the opposite of the one at MoMA. And so building on what we saw with Legray, where an artist really was using the medium in a flexible manner, Stieglitz did the same thing. Stieglitz also particularly famous for his portraits of Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe started out as an assistant, became his lover. At one point they were married, then they split up. She had an affair with Rebecca Strand, who ended up in New Mexico, and then had a young assistant, a young man who she ended up leaving everything to him at the end. And yet, through all of this, she carried the beacon for Stieglitz. She's the one who was responsible after he died for making sure that the National Gallery of Art had the kind of complete set of all of his work. And the Philadelphia Museum had a major collection, and MoMA and the Met had major collections. She was thinking of his legacy right all along. And I've had numerous students who, you know, they're 19, 20 years old, they start taking a picture of their girlfriend or their boyfriend, and all of a sudden I'm looking at 20, 30, 40 of these pictures of the same person, and I say, okay, if you're gonna do this, this is a thoroughly honorable exercise, but you need to go look at Stieglitz, because Stieglitz photographed Georgia O'Keeffe over a long period of time, and the photographs have a frankness and an honesty and an intimacy that I would argue has almost never been approached since. These two people just really had tremendous respect, love, admiration, and understanding of one another. And Stieglitz also had a huge influence on other people working with photography, like Paul Strand here, and two of his famous images, or Edward Steichen, and that's his picture of the Flatiron Building in New York in the middle. You see how I'm like giving you more than 10 pictures here. I figured out how to load up. Now I want to move on to Man Ray. Technically an American photographer, born in Philadelphia, but spent almost his entire life or working career in Paris, and very involved with the Dada and Surrealist movements. His great friend was Marcel Duchamp. They used to play chess together all the time. Duchamp would make chess sets in keeping with his whole thing about ready-made art. You know, Duchamp is famous for the toilet that he said was a piece of art. Anyway, Man Ray, working in Paris, doing work that really continually stretched the kind of what a photographer could do. Here's looking at some more of his work. That's a picture of Man Ray, and it's solarized. That's his process he used. And two of his classic images, Noir et Blanche, down in the bottom, and Glass Tears. Those tears aren't real. They're glycerin tears that he applied to the model. I think the model was Lee Miller. But going back to this one, so remember I showed you the Stieglitz, 395,000. This one sold last year. You may have caught it in the news, and I want to get the figure right. $12,412,500 just last year. And this was again, a print that he gave to a patron later in his career. The image was done in 1924, but they saw this in an exhibition in 1962 and bought it from Man Ray at the time. There's a lot going on in this picture. There's a lot more than meets the eye. It's called Violon d'Angle, referencing the great French painter d'Angle, who, in addition to being known as a painter, was also a violinist and took his violin playing quite seriously. And he wanted to be known as a violinist, but history does not regard him as a violinist, it regards him as a painter. But he, if you go to the d'Angle Museum in France, you will see his violin at the museum. And if you are conversant in French or you live in France, violon d'Angle became an idiom for a hobby that somebody takes quite seriously and is really devoted to. And the French, the phrase violon d'Angle means a hobby. And then Man Ray, kind of playing with that, was thinking of a hobby horse, which the French word for hobby horse is dada. So it brings him right back to this art movement that he was associated with. And all of that is kind of, all the information is right there in the picture if you're, pun intended, attuned to it. So, all right. Now I want to move on to one of the great portrait photographers of all time, August Sander, German. The picture we're looking at, three farmers on their way to a dance, 1914. Sander, working in Germany, took pictures of people, and he wasn't thinking them so much as individual portraits, but rather as archetypes. And here you see, that's a worker, the hod carrier, top left, a baker in the middle, bureaucrat, an artist actually in the kind of swan-like pose, soldier, another worker, children, and I think a lawyer in the bottom right. And Sonder took these portraits that nowadays we tend to see them individually in museums. They might have one or two or a few, but the way that Sonder always intended them to be shown was in grids with their class. And he took all of German society and broke it down into kind of class and social strata. And he always meant these pictures to be shown in large grid formats. Now hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to it. But I'm still moving along here, trying to come in on time. Cartier-Bresson, the godfather of photojournalism, the guy that kind of almost anybody working today owes him a great debt. Cartier-Bresson worked certainly during the height of his career in his later years almost exclusively with a Leica camera. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, Frank Horvat, who just died a couple years ago, has a major show in Paris right now. And Frank was a kind of acolyte of Cartier-Bresson's. And Frank used to take a picture with the viewfinder camera, kind of holding it down here. And Cartier-Bresson said, Frank, no, you feel with your gut, we see with our eyes. You need a camera, you need to get the camera up here. And you need to be quick, and you need to, that's how we operate. And Frank took those words to heart. And for Cartier-Bresson, it was true regardless of what he was photographing, whether it was people or places. He wrote a book, The Decisive Moment, which kind of summed up everything that he was doing in his work. And again, going back to this Gare Saint-Lazare picture, that is the apotheosis of the decisive moment. This guy jumping over the puddle, caught at exactly the moment where he has not yet broken the water, and he's there frozen in mid-stride in a way that only still photography could do. And what's interesting here, these are two pictures of Cartier-Bresson on the right at younger and later age, is we see that photography is a medium that translates very well to book form, better than painting or sculpture, which you really need to be in front of to experience fully. But photography works great in print, because it is printed. And so we're going to see, starting with Cartier-Bresson and going forward, that there are a number of artists who have done books that were really seminal in terms of establishing their careers and have had an enduring influence. Last year, yeah. I did an exhibition in New York, one of my artists, it was his first New York exhibition, and afterwards I thought, oh God, we should have spent all the money on doing a book instead. The books have legs, books live. An exhibition, it's whoever you can get to come see it. My adage these days is, an exhibition is the most expensive way to reach the fewest number of people. So anyway, books, big fan of books, and Cartier-Bresson really set the bar with The Decisive Moment because it absolutely encapsulated his whole approach to photography. And now we're going to buzz through a selection of some of his. And he traveled all over the world. He was in Germany. He was at the top left is actually outside the Kremlin in Moscow. Post-World War II, photojournalism, the Pope in the top right. I think the bottom right is Spain. He was in India. In the middle one, he's traveling around the United States with Cartier-Bresson traveled around the United States with Truman Capote. And it was Walker Evans who traveled around the United States with James Agee. Another important book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Anyway, and on the right, there he is back in Paris with Jean-Paul Sartre. And here, his portrait of Truman Capote, a young Truman Capote, right when he was really breaking into the literary scene in New York. So Cartier-Bresson traveled the whole world, knew everybody, and documented it. Now, I'm jumping over to work by Robert Frank. Again, a book, The Americans. Absolutely one of the most important photography books ever done. Robert Frank, who we see here in 3 different ages, just died recently, was born in Switzerland, but generally we say Frank, we needed somebody from outside the United States to show us ourselves. Frank showed us America in a way that we hadn't really been looking at until he came along. And with this publication of The Americans, he showed us kind of everything from busy cities, all sorts of different social strata, from wealthy at a ball, top left, kids on the street. The cowboy is actually in New York City, there for a rodeo. He showed us politics in America, and way ahead of his time, his real subject was race in America. He got very, very interested in the kind of division between black and white America. And to hop, skip, and jump back to this image that I started with, that's, again, a maid taking care of a white baby. The starkness of an image like this really kind of just came up on people and made them take notice. And Frank ended up having a huge influence on subsequent generations of photographers, an influence that is still being felt today. This is work by a guy named Larry Clark, who photographed, he was originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he did 2 seminal books, one called Tulsa and the other called Teenage Lust, that showed kind of sex, drugs, and guns in America, picking up kind of where Frank left off and showing us, again, another segment of society that was like right there, but maybe hadn't really been looked at. And the influence continues to Nan Goldin, another seminal book, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, which originally started as a slideshow. And you can still see it on occasion as a slideshow. MoMA has an edition of it. The Whitney has an edition. I think the edition is limited to 6. And it's accompanied by music. And what's interesting is the slideshow is always evolving. It is not static. So the version that you'll see at MoMA is different than the version that you'll see at the Whitney. But it's all then set in stone in this Aperture publication, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency. And where Frank and Larry Clark are kind of looking at America, Nan Goldin takes that approach but she's looking at herself. That's her in the bed in the middle, in the cover of the book, and in the lower right here, an image from her retrospective at the Whitney that was called "I'll Be Your Mirror," which some of you may recognize as the song title from a song by Nico, who was part of Andy Warhol's Factory. Anyway, Nan Goldin was interested in herself and her particular kind of chosen family. So she was hanging out with a gay, lesbian, bi society. She always said she wanted to make them look like they belonged in an issue of Vogue magazine. So like the one on the right, there they are in a cab, but looking glamorous. But the one on the left, top left, is of an art dealer in Paris named Gilles Ducin, who I knew, who was dying of AIDS and is being kissed goodbye by his longtime lover. And she documented that whole relationship. Here's some more of Nan's work. She's photographed young people. Now, she's not so young anymore, but she's still very kind of gravitating in that direction. So the top left and the bottom right are pictures she started to photograph, like the children of the friends that she grew up with. And this is all the influence of Robert Frank, but an inner-directed rather than outer-directed focus, and it continues with work by, here we're looking at Wolfgang Tillmans, who just had a major show at MoMA last year, and he's a young German photographer, although based in London most of the time, and again, photographing his circle of friends, and we continue all the way through to a guy named Ryan McGinley, who was the youngest artist ever to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum, and I started him off. I organized that show. That was 2003. He just had a show in Aspen, again, he's photographing his circle of friends, but the whole series of these pictures was called "The Kids Are All Right," taken from the Who song, and it was about how we've kind of come through the race and the drugs and the guns and the alcohol and the sex and dying of AIDS of all of the other artists who preceded him, and now he's saying, the kids are all right. We're actually doing just fine. And so he's the voice of his generation. Now I'm moving on. I'm close to on time. Dion Arbus, working in New York, photographing what she kind of wanted to see in New York, but not looking at society in general, but more at kind of the people on the margin, the freaks, so to speak. And her images have always had a very kind of disturbing nature to them. The boy with a hand grenade in Central Park, or the twins here. The one on the far right is actually a society portrait that she did for Harper's Bazaar. But even there, the way she photographs people, there's something disturbing about her pictures. And I mean, the great debate about Dion Arbus's work is whether she was kind of manipulating her subjects, whether she was taking advantage of them. But I would argue that she felt a great sympathy for these people, the people on the margins of society. And that's what we see in her work and what resonates. So Who can tell me what movie this is from? Anyone? This is a trick question. It's not from any movie. Cindy Sherman did, her whole life has done a series, untitled film stills. That is Cindy in the picture. She has always photographed herself. The gaze has now come fully, completely self-centered, but she has put herself in all these situations that look like they came out of a Hitchcock film. You're looking at these pictures and you're staring, going, I know that movie. That was North by Northwest, right? No, not true. The Hitchhiker in the top right. And Cindy started taking these pictures. She was up in the Rochester, Buffalo area, and when she was in school, she was barely scraping by, and anybody that wanted to could pick up one of these pictures for $25 to $50, and she would have been extremely happy. And a number of years later, in the 1990s, Madonna funded the Museum of Modern Art acquisition of a complete set of 77 of the Untitled Film Stills series for millions of dollars. And now, a single Cindy Sherman image sells for like $2 million. And the whole thing about dollars is not to necessarily impute worth or value. It's just an interesting measure of how far photography has come along. The whole modern photography market really didn't start until the 1970s. Walker Evans was at one point selling his pictures for like $5. And now we have that Man Ray, Violon Dang, for $12 million. So, I'm at 10. Here we go, we're finishing up. Bern and Hilla Becker, German artists, both deceased now, but go back to what I said about August Sonder, these portraits as archetypes. So Bern and Hilla Becker picked up from Sonder and then moved it forward. They photographed all these industrial structures as archetypes, but they're individual portraits, really. And they would always show the work in grids, not as individual pieces. So heavily influenced by Sonder. And is that going to stay? Yes. Doing these industrial portraits. And you start to see the individual characteristics of these structures, whether they were coal tipples or water towers, and they photographed throughout Europe. They were also hugely influential because they were educators. They were based in Dusseldorf, and they created what became known as the Dusseldorf School of Photography, and had a huge influence on somebody like Thomas Ruff and Günter Forg. Here we're seeing portraits by Ruff, which again, shown in a grid, and an influence on somebody. We're going to end here with Andreas Gursky. Now, remember what I said about Gustave Le Gray, the Great Wave, 3 negatives comprising one picture? So Gursky studied under Bern and Hilla Becker, but his father was a commercial photographer, and he came up with a very kind of straightforward photography training. But then he works, first of all, this picture, you're looking at it about the size that the actual print is. He works on a massive scale, and he's using scale and the kind of impact it has for real import. And he's doing things that we've seen before, but we may not recognize. And his images, as with Gustave Le Gray, are constantly fluctuating between straight photography and manipulated photography. So I was sitting with Gursky, talking to him about this picture, and this is the view from his studio. And I said, "That's a beautiful view, that's fantastic." And he said, "Oh, no, it doesn't look like that." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "No, there's like a highway over here, and there's a building in front, and there's," he said, "I don't have that view, but that's the view I want to have." And so he took everything out. And this picture exists just as Gustave Le Gray's did 100 and some years prior, manipulated, but to fit his artistic conception. And that's my 10 pictures, or 10 photographs for a history, not the history of photography. I gave this lecture in San Francisco about a year or so ago, and I realized I had left out Ansel Adams, not Walker Evans, but all the great kind of California-based photographers. Could have rewritten the list completely. It's just a subjective look at 10 artists and 10 photographs that tell us something about how far photography has traveled. So, questions? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello?
I notice even in the more contemporary photographs, a lot of it is black and white versus color. Is there a reason that you chose black and white versus color?
Can you all hear me? I'm not in front of the mic now, but you can still hear me, right? I started collecting photography in like 86, 87. I had this academic background. Now I have my, there we go. My academic background was with 17th century Dutch and French painting, but I got interested in collecting photography, and that's what started all of this. And there was a period there when I wouldn't consider acquiring any work in color. I mean, again, if I'd wanted to, I could have thrown William Eggleston in here. I talked about the godfather of photojournalism, Cartier-Bresson, but I could have talked about the godfather of color photography, which would either be Eggleston or, God, I have a whole selection of his photographs. Harold Edgerton? No, not Harold Edgerton. That's the stop motion. I'm drawing a blank. But the point is, there were people who were doing dye transfer prints, which was really archival. And initially, we thought that color photography was not archival. You know, we looked at that piece by Niepce, and it's still around. You can go see it. But we worried that a lot of color photography was very fugitive. I mean, David Hockney has been very interested in working with Polaroid photography, and Polaroids were never meant to last. But my whole focus has really shifted. Just for the purpose of the lecture, we've got a lot of black and white, but certainly in terms of what I'm collecting now or showing, it's almost large-scale color work. My latest acquisition is a piece by Gregory Crewdston, and he works large-scale color.
Well, my understanding is color, you sort of mentioned it, is not permanent. Black and white is permanent.
Well, now we consider color archival. There are, you can get prints that are considered archival. So we don't hesitate to buy them. Yeah, there's a question coming up in the back. Go ahead.
You mentioned the growth of photography primarily starting out as seeing what you see naturally, and as photography as a science has changed over the years, we've been able to learn to manipulate these photographs. Isn't it true that every photographer who takes their work into a darkroom is essentially manipulating the photograph, because they no longer, their mind's eye defines what it is they want to show you? We certainly see that in people like Ansel Adams and many of the landscape photographers.
Sure. Ansel Adams' most famous image, Moonrise over Hernandez, if you look at an early print of it and then a later print, they're completely different. It started out as a dayscape and ended up as a nightscape. And part of the reason is Ansel is this really important bridge figure. He wasn't limiting the number of prints that he made. The idea of limiting editions is a modern construct. It actually starts in printmaking with Henry McNeill Whistler, and then comes into photography. And it's completely artificial. There's no reason why you have to limit the number of photographs you take, except for modern marketing purposes. It's a way of getting people to decide if they want to acquire something or not. Ansel, I say, is this bridge figure because he starts out, Moonrise over Hernandez was in what we call an open edition. There are, as far as we know, something like approximately 1,000 prints of that image that exist. And I guarantee you, towards the end of his life, Ansel must have been rolling his eyes, because people were coming up to him, and like any artist, he wants to talk about what he's working on today. And people were still coming up to him 40 years later saying, "Oh my God, Mr. Adams, I love that Moonrise over Hernandez picture." He must have been like, "Give me a break." And what actually happens is a really important dealer, a guy named Harry Lunn, came along and he told Ansel, "That's it, no more. We're going to make what we call the Master Museum set. They're going to be in a limited edition of 10. We're going to tell these museums, you've been admiring Ansel's work forever, but you haven't bought it. This is it. You're going to buy it now or you're going to miss out." And so Ansel swung over to editioning his prints. But I want to go back to something you said. You used the word the science of photography. And photography is a medium that encompasses kind of everything. It's got all the tools. It is a scientific medium, but everything that I've been talking about here is really the artistry of photography. Having said that, I had two conversations. Once, I was at a black tie party that had nothing to do with the art world, and this guy across from me at the table said, "I've taken more photographs than anybody you've ever encountered." Okay, why? And he said he was what do you call them? A mortuary photographer. What do you call the guys who deal with dead bodies? I'm drawing a blank. Not a mortician, though. The doctor. He's a doctor of... What is it? Yeah, that's it. There. And he used photography. He photographed dead bodies every time they came in. Multiple pictures for evidence. And I'm looking at him like, okay, you've taken more photographs than anybody I ever met. And then another time, I'm sitting with somebody who worked at the Hubble Planetarium. And he said that astronomy now is entirely, 100%, a photographic medium. Nobody is sitting there looking through a telescope anymore. I mean, maybe they are when they're in the Boy Scouts, but if you become a serious photographer, you're working in a facility and you're looking through the lens of a camera. And they use the camera to capture what they're looking at, and then they manipulate the pictures in order to be able to kind of see what's out there that they couldn't even see with their naked eye, like to look at stars. So to go back to your question, yes, everybody is making artistic choices, even if it's in a scientific set of circumstances.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that to some extent. However, there are those, as you talked about, this mortician or whoever the individual
Right.
is. For those of us who have used photography in our businesses, I was an aircraft accident investigator, and the idea was to manipulate the photographs so that you could bring out the evidence so that it could be used to make certain determinations, whether it was about what caused the accident, where the particular pieces broke up, or so forth.
But photography has always been a medium about like making choices. I remember once talking to a painter, and painters start in the middle of a canvas and work out. Photographers are always thinking of framing and the composition. If you're photographing an accident, are you looking over here at the destroyed car, or are you looking over there at the tire tracks where he applied the brakes? It's about how you compose a picture, and you are making choices that inform how we end up reacting to what we're looking at. Yeah, over here.
Hold on, we're going to take one more question,
Oh.
and then Peter is going to join us for the social.
social, okay.
And so there'll be lots of times to
Yeah,
engage
we'll
with
just
him.
keep
Here you go.
talking.
So you were, we've seen photography from the very old days with the 8x10 cameras and the hoods, and you were mentioning before maybe the Rolleiflexes down at the waist,
Right.
and then, up in the eye. When did that transition happen? Was it really Cartier-Bresson that got it up there, or was there someone else who did
No,
that?
I really think Cartier-Bresson was the kind of most important figure in that regard, because he started using the Leica, which was a very lightweight and fast, and also for him, importantly, quiet camera. And so he was able to kind of hold the camera here and then bring it up to his eye very quickly. He was called the cat. He moved with cat-like reflexes. And that's when photojournalism really takes off, because you can be in the middle of a bunch of Frenchmen post-World War II interrogating somebody who's a woman who's accused of being a collaborator, which is one of the images that I showed. And, right in the midst of this hostile crowd, and bring the camera up, take the picture, and move it back down very quickly. Now, of course, we're all like this. We're all taking selfies. Although I like to take pictures of people, and I go around New York, and a friend of mine, and the artist I know, says, "You're taking sneakograms," because I'm trying to capture people when they're not aware that they're being photographed. So, okay, so now we're...
Yes, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thank you. We'll be sending out a follow-up survey, and we hope that you all take a couple minutes to fill this out, because we really appreciate your feedback and our funding depends on it. And I just want to let you know there's so many great programs coming up at the Boulder JCC. One that I want to specifically mention, October 24th, we're featuring True Colors. We're bringing in a theater company from LA called The Braid for a salon-style theater production about yearning for belonging and the rich and complicated question that is identity. This is going to be a fabulous presentation. I hope you all can join us. Can you please give Peter another huge round of applause?
Thank you.
Please stick around. We'll have some snacks and mingle and ask more questions, and we really appreciate you all coming.